Over 2 slides in a moment. Welcome everyone, and we're recording now. I'm excited for today's webinar, whereas for some live webinars, the organizational scheme doesn't totally come together prior to the webinar. For this one, I think it has come together quite well. And as a matter of fact, it's an organizational scheme for law of implication in general. I think today can be a kind of a, not so much a turning point as like a kind of a turning up point, where it'll be kind of much easier to kind of overall understand and organize the overall idea of law of implication and then the sub ideas within it. I've been working on this for 2 or 3 months at this point, and it just sort of came together completely, or I don't know, completely is the perfect word, but so let's just take a look here. So if I come over here with what's on this slide here, we can, in essence, encapsulate law of implication and my approach and kind of the approach to success, strategy, understanding life, and so forth, right? In the first definitive series webinar, which was live, and this might end up becoming the second one, or I might end up doing a second one recorded. Either way, it's fine. No matter what, this will be a great supplement to the second or the whole series, the second video in it, or in the whole series in general. So approaching life in terms of strategy isn't really optional, right? That encompasses your prioritizing, your decision making, your goals, your planning, everything that kind of frames your doing, right? So it's not really optional, and it's not really like a subset of life. It sort of frames your entire life and frames the quality of your life. So when I talk about success, again, success isn't really a subset of life or a subtopic in life. Of course, the specifics of success can be different from person to person, but the overall frame of both coming up with the right things to go for in life, making decisions that are going to make yourself better off and other people better off as well, that is something that everyone's going to want to do, right? And it's not like one part of life that you want to get right. It's kind of frames your entire life, and then the rest is sort of details within that. So we're really looking at the most important questions, how to approach them, and answers in law of implication. We first started with our major organizing principle in the first definitive series video regarding bottlenecks. And I defined that in an expansive way, where it's not just bottlenecks, but it's things like getting started, having enough momentum to get through obstacles, making sure you're not on the wrong path that seems like the right path, making sure you're not missing a hidden path, etc. Anything that can serve to impede you on the way to your next goal. And then we could also understand that all of our goals could be understood and organized in the sense of they're all dealing with bottlenecks. So life becomes framed by identifying bottlenecks, figuring out what to do about them, and continuing onward on a quest to have the best value of your life experience and the experience of your entire existence, regarding what might happen after your life on Earth, for yourself and for everybody else, right? Once we're no longer afraid and desperate, and once we have a sense of how to overall succeed in having a good or best or better quality of existence for ourselves, then it's just natural and logical that we would want that for other people. And once we want it for others that might be close to us, then as long as we don't feel helpless and small and desperate, then we're gonna, pretty obviously, that logically extends to all people or all conscious beings and so forth, that we'd rather them be better off rather than worse off, right? How much we might sacrifice if we had to sacrifice, that might be an open question, right? But if it's just going to be the same or better for us for other people to be better off as well, then we want that. So ultimately, we want things to be better for everybody, just in the simple, basic sense of better for now, right? As we understand more about the nature of who we are, our mind and thinking and so forth, then maybe we can hone in even better on what better means. But in a general sense, we can have a general idea of what is happier and nicer rather than not, we want that. And then it's a matter of identifying bottlenecks and breaking them on the way to that, right? So again, we can reframe every idea of a goal to that. And then we can understand the idea of prioritizing goals and prioritizing resources based on the relative impact of the different bottlenecks, right? So now we have a kind of a sense of goals, right? I've early on, starting out talking about Law of Implication years ago, I talked about our mind. We could understand it in one sense as like a goal achieving mechanism, right? And so now we can have an even clearer like idea of that when it comes to bottlenecks. The nice thing about bottlenecks is that it's something that our minds can grasp in a pretty straightforward fashion. You see, there's going to be another step as we continue with each other. And obviously people that have been following me for a while, they're familiar with some of this. So if you're new, then it applies if I say this is new. And of course, if you've been with me for years, then it might not be new. But there's a big conceptual step, which has to do with consciousness, and it has to do with understanding who we are as distinct from our minds, and where we get more understanding, more awareness, more practice, more skilled at the distinction between our mind, which is important and attached to us and very relevant, and it does all kinds of stuff and thinking and processing and so forth, between our mind and understanding, but that our mind is not conscious, and that any activity or process or whatever that needs consciousness as part of it, our mind can't handle on its own. And when people start with Law of Implication, they're very confused, whether they realize it or not. They might not feel confused, but they're very blurry about the idea of consciousness. It's quite a mystery to both lay people and scientists or whoever's. But it doesn't need to be a mystery. It's only a mystery because people are starting in the wrong place, in essence. But the topic of consciousness is going to be something that's going to take shape over time. If you want me to instantly explain it so that you quote unquote get it, if you're new, then that's it's not going to really, I'm not even going to attempt to fully explain it or say that I'm going to fully explain it right this moment. So it's going to keep on getting revealed or understood better. We're going to keep on assembling pieces that will help us. But once we introduce concepts that involve consciousness, such as the quality of your experience, in other words, good, or one of the meanings of good, or knowledge, knowing, right? There's kind of a conscious and a non-conscious version of these concepts, because our mind is what is used to process and remember these things and store knowledge about everything, right? Our whole kind of sense of reality. And our mind's not conscious. So we're going to keep running into this issue of needing our mind to think, needing to work with our mind, but then our mind not being conscious. And that issue is at the heart of a whole cascade of what could be problems or what could really start to work in your favor. Is that, again, things like goodness, thinking, love, knowledge, knowing, goals, all of these ideas and who you are, like your identity, you, the very idea you, even things like reality, the material world, the environment, all of these things, they consciousness, without consciousness and without a correct understanding of consciousness, we're going to have kind of a blurry double meaning of these concepts. So as soon as I start to talk about anything that involves consciousness as a part of the meaning, then we're going to run into difficulty until the pieces kind of assemble themselves enough that you really get the distinction of consciousness, and also how the lack of it impacts our mind's processing, our mind's ideas, our mind's construct of reality, and so forth. So it's going to keep being an issue. But the beautiful thing about how I'm organizing things now that's finally come to me with Law of Implication is that when we start with bottlenecks, the nice thing about bottlenecks in and of themselves is that our mind can grasp it before we have really much understanding of consciousness. So that's really big because that gives us a hook and a starting point that people can grasp. and that's going to kind of anchor us in a certain way. As we continue on to a place where necessarily you're going to have to feel a little bit confused and embrace that, and understanding that just like a detective trying to solve a murder, you would first are going to need to assemble clues, and sometimes you won't even know if a clue is a clue. Like it could be like a potential clue, right? So you're assembling pieces, but you don't know what the final puzzle looks like, right? It's like you're trying to do a jigsaw puzzle, except that there's pieces that don't belong mixed in, there's some pieces maybe missing, and you somehow need to take what you have and assemble things until you kind of get, okay, wait, these pieces don't fit in, and you have enough that the picture kind of assembles itself, even if maybe some are missing, or maybe then you have ways you can find the missing pieces or whatever. So when it comes to everything to do with consciousness, which is, again, we're going to really touch on that, and everywhere we start to look or think about or me talk, we're going to be running into things that are where consciousness becomes relevant, and therefore it's in a certain sense confusing. So you want to accept and embrace that, understanding that we're going to keep on filling in pieces until things make sense. So if we follow the idea that our mind is not conscious and that we are, and remember what I just said, even as I say that sentence, it doesn't need to make full sense, right? I'm going to be touching on consciousness constantly, and to the extent that what I say only partially makes sense, that's okay, because the only way to make that, to alleviate that, is to continue. So if we're not our minds, if our minds are not conscious and we are, but we need to work with our mind, then on the previous webinar, which was not in the definitive series, it was just a discussion, and Matai came on and it was great, and we were talking about free will, power, and like kind of the seat of our conscious power of free will as one of the main topics. Your success, your quality of existence, your quality of life, and the people that you impact around you and as ripple effects throughout your life, the contribution that you make to your life is going to be related to whatever your power, your ability, your free will is. If you are conscious, then your free will is going to be, we can start to at least guess, and I'm not really guessing at this point, but for you following along, to the extent that this is new, then if we're conscious, then our contribution is going to maybe have something to do with the fact that we're conscious, something that only a conscious participant in our whole mind, body, and us situation that's going on. That's something we can participate with consciously to team up with the tool of our mind and our body, right? But our mind and our body, there's a certain way that they can function perhaps automatically, right? If they're not us, if they're in one sense made of molecules and outside of our direct knowledge, then in a certain sense, they're going to be operating as a mechanism. And it would be some sort of conscious teaming up or conscious participation or interference even, or something that would go along with the mind. And if we did that, then we would be exercising our actual power as conscious beings that have free will. Again, not everything I'm saying needs to make full sense. All right, just have to start somewhere and continue. So as let me think here. So what our mind is doing is it's giving us something, and our mind is probably involved in this, right? If we're just again, I'm a little bit leading you through from your perspective here, like from kind of where you're at. So if we're just starting to think about things and we want our life to be better, we want to make better decisions, we want to think about what the bottlenecks are. Our mind and whatever else is involved with giving us our sensory experience, but also we have an internal experience of thoughts, right? And a feeling like certain things matter, certain things are important. All sorts of conclusions about people and whether we should trust them, whether we should go along with them, whether we should go with their authority, whether we should team up with them, whether we should go against them, who we should invest in, what actions we should take to do stuff, whether we should show up at work, right? So our mind is giving us a sense of reality. It's giving us a sense of what we should expect the next moment, right? Whether we are reflectively aware of this or not, this is what's going on, right? We have a sense of a flow of time and kind of what we feel like doing next. And as I talked about in the bottlenecks webinar, the first definitive series, one of the things that goes on is that the conclusions that our mind comes to are not always correct. And they're not always adaptive. So another type of conclusion might just be a response that we do in the moment to another person or to a situation. We could be alone and have a response like a frustration or just being bored or wanting to give up that might be adaptive and helpful for what we're trying to accomplish, and it might not be, but it isn't always, right? We might need to get up but not feel like giving up out of bed, right? Or there might be activity that's good for us to do, but then we feel like putting it off, and it's kind of an overwhelming or strong enough feeling that we do, in fact, keep putting it off. And then when we get around to it, we might even feel good and a burst of energy, and it would have been better to have done that originally or earlier, and we just didn't, right? So there's, and then certainly looking at other people, we can see all sorts of maladaptive beliefs, actions, responses, views of reality, overall life philosophies, credos, etc. That other people have, right? And so if we see it in others, then it only makes sense to think that our mind could theoretically make similar mistakes if other people around us are doing the same thing, right? Just assuming that our mind's not going to make mistakes when other people's do isn't a great idea. So on this slide, I have, in essence, a kind of full flow or full frame of law of implication, and a law of implication is just my decades-long, pretty skillful attempt at realizing what's going on with our quality of life, our strategy, our success, our thinking, accurate thinking, and so forth. Recognizing that the deepest bottleneck we have has to do with how to know what's true regarding our own minds, not even regarding what's in the news or what other people are telling us, but that our own minds can make us feel certain and sure about some things that can be incorrect. And so the underlying method of filtering ideas for whether they're adaptive or useful or correct, and so forth. And ideas include your responses and beliefs and all sorts of things that lead to your communications and actions and decisions and what you do. That then results in how much money you make, how your relationships progress or regress, and so forth. Your own peace of mind and feeling of well-being, all of that. And all these things kind of have a ripple and snowball and spiral effect, up or down. So the deepest bottleneck has to do with a method of somehow getting to the bottom of figuring out a method that's accurate, that we can use on our own mind itself to start to dissolve some incorrect or unhelpful or just cluttering beliefs. Let me go to the slide here I made a slide like this a while ago, and people found it very helpful. And what these are arrows, and they represent like different vectors, like different feelings, beliefs, goals you might have in your mind. Because in reality, at any one time, it isn't like you just have like one clear, uncluttered goal. Sometimes you functionally come very close to that. And there's a word called like being in a flow, right? And it's very nice and it's efficient. You lose track of time in kind of a fairly useful way, up until that's not useful anymore to lose track of time. But sometimes it's nice to have that kind of timeless feeling where you're into what you're doing and it's working out nicely. You're neither bored nor are you overly stressed or challenged, and that's good. But overall, in life, people, the way that the mind absorbs and decides on goals, we have all these different what amounts to like vectors or goals going in different directions, right? Like, so you might there might be all kinds of benefits to getting up and going to work on a project of some sort, let's say for yourself, for your career, that's self-driven, right? Though, then there might be other people that you're in communication with that want you to do something else, or just are acting like something else is important, right? So those people's communications with you, even if they're just sort of doing that thing, or you even just know they're waiting for you to finish what you're doing so you can go pay attention to them. And even if you're imagining that, it's still a vector in your mind, right? Like you feel like the person's impatient or waiting on you. So it could be people around you. It could be other tugs or niggling things that are on your mind that maybe you feel like you should do first, right? It could be that the activity that you're doing has led to things in the past that have also had something that makes you want to avoid it, like rejection or a feeling of being slow or stupid because you're not learning or progressing on the task fast enough. It's kind of maybe new to you, right? That happens a lot when you're an entrepreneur. Maybe there's a lack of a feeling of certainty, like it'll get you results, right? And that lack of a feeling of certainty is kind of like a vector working against you, right? So there's all sorts of potentially competing goals. There's the idea of wanting to feel like you're smart, wanting to feel like you make progress, but at the same time, you have things that are kind of in favor of you doing, like working on that particular task, right? So part of one way to think about the law of implication as kind of a phrase or a meaning of that is, as opposed to the law of attraction, which once people get done hearing it, I think that it ends up, at least in their minds, being overly simple in a detrimental way, where it sort of ignores these vectors that are often not obvious. And where the law of attraction is like, well, thoughts are things, and what you focus on, that's kind of what you get in a certain way. Right? And I don't mean to overly simplify it past the way it's already simplified or so forth. But with the law of implication, one way to think of it is that, sure, thoughts are things, and you're going to get kind of the resulting vectors of your thoughts and beliefs and so forth. But there's all sorts of invisible vectors going on, and you're going to generally get the sum total of these different vectors pulling and pushing in different directions. And in other words, we need to go deeper, kind of deeper and wider in our seeking understanding. So, because really seeking understanding of these vectors is, in many cases, in a certain way in life, going to be extremely efficient, rather than this relates to the picture I had in the first definitive series with the cart, right? Rather than focusing so much on the cart and just pushing it harder, right? When we go back to these vectors, just trying to use more willpower and focus more on the vector towards, like this, in this example that I use, the entrepreneurial task that you want to accomplish. So willpower is like you're just trying to focus here, right? It's not that that's irrelevant, right? Trying to strengthen this vector directly isn't, it might be one of the helpful things, all right? And once you get started, that might automatically lead to momentum, which then strengthens it, right? When you get started on something, you'll tend to pick up some amount of momentum. So that can be helpful. But there's more potential, there's additional potential efficiency to be had in understanding these other vectors and potentially dissolving them. And as we continue with this definitive series, as you continue with me in general, and as you continue with me in the past, then we've helped to understand and be aware of, and then of course dissolve or reduce vectors that we don't want, Sometimes they're based on just fully false or contradictory ideas, right? The most common one that I talk about a lot is this general vector for you to either uphold your standards and norms, particularly about yourself, and or very related, they're almost one and the same, is your kind of sense of needing to feel either smart or smart enough or not so stupid, and or moral. So between competence and morality, people want to feel like they're a certain amount confident and a certain amount not immoral by their own standards and norms or by what's hidden in their mind. And if they're, say, doing a task for this entrepreneurial task and they're working with someone and that person says something that feels insulting or critical in a way that then all of a sudden their vector for wanting to feel smart enough, or there could be nobody around and you're just working on understanding some software and you don't feel like you're learning it fast enough, just kind of arbitrarily, like your mind just kind of invisibly comes up with a calculation of how fast you should learn this software, how good a job the people that designed it should have done with the user interface. And at some point you either get angry at them or frustrated with yourself or angry at yourself or something that you're not living up to that standard. But that's a whole different vector than simply accomplishing what you need to accomplish with the software, right? And that can come to the forefront. And that's a predictable, powerful, overwhelmingly common one that everyone falls prey to a significant degree, right? I've talked about how, for example, men can just kind of spend all of their money on getting a certain type of validation from women or from their colleagues, right? Or whatever. Or people can burn projects to the ground because of something like this, which I've seen plenty, right? So people will really shift to paying everything for upholding their standards and their belief about, their standards and norms about themselves. Or they'll feel an overwhelming aversion to doing something new, right? Because of the potential feeling of stupidity or rejection or whatever, right? So since we all fall prey to that to a very large degree, until and unless we have a very kind of deep digging into understanding this type of thing, then we really have to get deep and wide into context in order to uproot and dissolve that powerful and detrimental vector for ourselves. And so for pretty much anyone, dealing with that is going to be very efficient in life, because however many hours it might take you to figure that out and understand it and dissolve it, it's likely going to be just wildly more efficient than what you would spend resource-wise otherwise, including just fully burned projects or relationships or whatever that might, and all the hours and resources that might come from that, and or that have been put into those before they got burned, or the opportunity cost, right, of kind of not doing certain things. So this word I have here, the second word, that's sort of in one sense, a central concept of this webinar, is this idea of quarantining conclusions, right? Quarantine, pretty popular or well-known word. Might have some negative emotional connotations at this point with the pandemic and so forth. But anyhow, at least we're familiar with it. So our mind is giving us conclusions nonstop. Normally, people don't even think of it that way. Normally, this is so normal and part of our experience that these conclusions are not presented as conclusions, they're just presented as reality, truth. But they're hardly even presented as truth. And on my next slide, I'm going to give you a whole bunch of examples of types of conclusions that our mind is inserting. It's kind of like in the news these days, right? Obviously, we're seeing more and more. It's becoming more obvious since, let's say, the 70s or 80s, when it wasn't so obvious to people. With every decade, right? It just becomes so clear that in the news you're getting two things mixed together, right? You're getting that's exactly parallel to this. I'm only just using this for the sake of example, right? But in addition to reporting what might be facts, right? And yeah, a fact could be wrong, right? But if you're saying like a bomb went off in this building or whatever, right? Then that's still a certain type of thing. It could be right or wrong, but and in one sense, it's a conclusion that yeah, it did happen. But when in the news these days, you get a lot more than even that, right? You just get a ton of bias in terms of what fits the narrative, what's reported in the first place, and then the slant on it, right? And so forth. And essentially our mind is doing that to us constantly, where if someone wasn't aware that was going on, and they kind of took the facts and the bias and the opinion all together as one, then of course that would make them a very naive consumer of news, and how where their political outlook would be pretty much just determined by what station they watch, right, or whatever. And as a matter of fact, and just I said this because it's parallel, the decision not just on how to frame the news, but on what gets airtime and what gets ignored, right, is an underlying massive source of bias that's going to very strongly color our beliefs and our outlook and our judgments about political parties and so forth. And so not only is it the bias slant, but then what's reported on and what isn't, right? What takes up amount of airtime and what isn't. And it's like that with our minds, where we have that same thing going on, right? Where our mind is giving us a sense of importance, including by what it focuses on and what it doesn't even really bring up. So to the extent that it helps you picture, we have something very similar going on with our minds that happens in the news. And if it was important to vote properly, let's say, then it would be an urgent and important bottleneck to understand what was happening with the news and consume somehow in a way that counteracted the bias in terms of the slant and the importance, right? And what was covered, what wasn't. With our minds, then, in the same way, again, I'm not talking about the news here, I'm using it as just an example. I'm talking about your mind and how you want to interact with it. It's extremely impactful on your life. As a matter of fact, it's in essence the only impact you have. It cuts right to the bottom of your real true power. And by using your real true power, you're really doing the one thing that will then create a cascade in the environment, including starting in your mind, right? In a certain sense, your mind is in the environment relative to yourself. It's very strongly tied to you. You're responsible for it in a certain way. But you don't control every molecule in your mind, right? It's still out there somewhere outside of your direct knowledge and control. And it's super important and impactful, right? Obviously for your life, your mind. So your leverage is going to come down to this quarantining of conclusions, where it's not that you do or don't accept conclusions, but it's, again, if you imagine being a detective and you're starting to look at clues, then one of the real skills is to be able to, you can realize that a certain clue points in a certain direction towards a certain person being the murderer, right? So it isn't that you ignore the fact that conclusion, okay, this is a gun this person owns, or this person is clearly lying about something important, right? If someone's lying about something important for a crime, then that's in essence evidence that is in favor of the conclusion that person did it. You can be aware that it's in essence evidence for that, but quarantine the conclusion in the sense that you're not jumping to the conclusion, but you're also not even trying to weight the conclusion. You're not trying to like say, okay, well, that conclusion moved forward by this much. Like, it's now, instead of 40% likely this person did it, now it's 60% likely. You really just want to quarantine it all. You're aware of the conclusion, it's sitting there, but it's no longer a conclusion that's rubber stamped. It's no longer a conclusion that's basically affecting things as a vector. It doesn't have force. It's just there. And I'm about to go into some examples. I just want to make sure I kind of overview this slide. So it's going to turn out that this is radically important. It's basically what you do as a conscious being. And if your mind thinks in terms of bottlenecks. You kind of direct it that way or whatever. If it gives, in other words, if your mind gives you a conclusion, like, oh, because what we're going to do is we're going to get down to foundationalism. See, and one of the things you want to not do when you're listening to me is to try and categorize, marginalize, be like, oh, you're talking about don't jump to conclusions, or you're talking about, oh, you're saying, David, don't make assumptions. No, I'm not saying that. All right. So you could say or write down, maybe David's talking about this. You could frame it in terms of a question, right? Then you're not jumping to a conclusion. But if you too much or to whatever extent that you try and make analogies, categorize what you might think of as understanding, but it's really just associating something that kind of blocks your ability to hear and see what I'm seeing, as what I'm saying as well. By kind of jumping forward and deciding that you can rephrase what I'm talking about. You can have a question about that. That's different. See, a question about a conclusion is pretty much one and the same with quarantining the conclusion, right? So you can be aware of a conclusion, but not rubber stamp it. So if someone were listening to me and said, oh, maybe what David's saying is don't, like don't make assumptions. That's okay. But if you say, okay, David's saying don't make assumptions, then your mind gave you a conclusion about what I'm saying that's going to block you from maybe hearing me as well as you could. But we are not going to want to end at just not having a bunch of conclusions that are conclusive, right? We are going to then, like if you're a detective, you want to actually solve the murder, right? You don't want to pat yourself on the back for saying, hey, guess what? I found all these clues and I was smart and I didn't jump to conclusions. They're like, well, who did it? You're like, well, I don't know, but I'm cool because I didn't jump to conclusions, right? Well, yeah, that's the process of getting to the right conclusion, is to not rubber stamp conclusions, right? And to do that, you need to recognize conclusions that your mind is giving you as conclusions, which if you're starting out with me, or even if you've been with me for a while, you want to take on the idea that you're not a master yet at doing that. And particularly if someone's new, it's going to be a real kind of mystery. It's a very new thing to distinguish conclusions from the rest of the kind of raw experience or raw data that you're getting from your mind. Again, you don't block out conclusions, you just recognize them as conclusions. And then they kind of get circled, quarantined, and now you have raw data that my mind gave me this conclusion. It's there, right? Kind of like saying, it seems that if this is the murder weapon, then that would seem to lead to the conclusion that this person might be, might more likely be the murderer, but you're not like moving the bar towards a conclusion. You don't see that as progress where the conclusion's now more likely or not. That kind of way of operating it becomes nonsense when you see things correctly. You're trying to get to a point where conclusions are inescapable. Now, I made there's a live webinar, which is now a video, that is the part 2 of the Law of Implication Explained series from earlier in this year. And it's been watched a lot for this, at least relative to my channel, current views and so forth. And it's called The Method, right? The first video in the Explained series is interesting too. It talks about local peak theory, which is a useful piece of the puzzle for things. Everything will fit into this framework scheme that I have here on this slide. But the method, you can go back and watch that video as we continue, either, or some of you watched it a lot, probably listening now, but that can fit right in with all of this. And I don't need to redo that video in the sense that it's there. And it goes over well and on a certain method for how to approach getting to correct conclusions. So we're going to want to get to accurate conclusions. And that's critical. And as we assemble accurate conclusions, they're there and they're solid and we have them forever as places to stand or places to potentially stand. Whether, sometimes you can have pieces of knowledge that but they might not be relevant for a particular task or thing you're thinking about. But the more of those you have, the kind of deeper and more more pervasive and foundational they are for your life, such as who you are, who your mind is, understanding consciousness, right? Things like that are going to come into play constantly as background. So there's accurate things that we can come to, accurate conclusions, but we can't come to accurate conclusions until and unless we stop rubber stamping all of our conclusions. And that will force our mind to keep opening up new conceptual space, being creative, going back to the drawing board, metaphorically speaking, until it gives us what we're looking for and what we need. So with law of implication, we can now understand that we start with something easy to grasp, which is that strategy in life, and strategy frames our whole life, period, regardless of who you are, no matter what you think is important, no matter what your talents are, no matter what topics you're doing, your career, or your preferences in life, or anything. Strategy frames all your actions and your responses. Strategy comes down to bottlenecks. There is no other correct answer to how to approach things strategically than to have it organized around bottlenecks. And again, bottlenecks in the expansive way I talked about last webinar. Then, absolutely critical is to learn better and better to identify conclusions as conclusions and quarantine them. And to understand what that means, to get more practiced at it, your mind will make it easier and easier for you, right? The way our minds work is that they basically get better, right, at what, like basically bad leads to bad, good leads to good with our mind, and practice leads to, a strengthening of whatever pathway, right? Whatever pathways are tread in our minds, it gets, easier. So as the very idea of learning to quarantine conclusions, learning means it's stored in your mind, not in you. Stuff isn't stored in you, it's stored in your mind. So mind doesn't only have to be physical. You could have part of your mind or some aspect of mind or some overlapping duplicate mind that we might call spirit or whatever, that functions like a mind does and that can survive after your life on Earth, theoretically. I'm not saying you do or don't, but when I say mind or something stored in your mind, doesn't have to be stored in your physical earthly brain or not. Just speaking kind of logically and basically, in case that is a question. If you focus on quarantining conclusions, then I'm asserting now, I'm not saying you'll fully understand just because I say it or know it because I say it, but you will be maximizing your power. However much you do it, then your power is just like something that's on, that when it's on, and that will shift the default of your mind, which will then shift the default of the environment around you to a certain degree. And it's not going to necessarily be a massive shift instantly, but over time, things will get better and better in your mind and in your environment. It doesn't mean you're immune from disasters or whatever, right? But things will just get better and better and better. There isn't like an exact necessarily threshold, right, where you're saved or you're enlightened or whatever. Regardless of whether you are always using your power or not, right? It'll just make things better when you use it. And when you don't use it, it's not that things get worse or not, they just kind of operate by default. And there's all sorts of bad ideas and stuff outside, right? There's just all sorts of bad stuff that can happen by neglect and by luck and, and just predictable happenstance. But the more everyone does this, the more the overall environment has better ideas in it, and therefore the better off people are. Our mind is basically going to get stuff from the outside and then stuff from itself, and it will make better stuff itself whenever you quarantine conclusions, right? Otherwise, it'll just kind of go by default. It's basically fully kind of getting what it's getting from the outside, and then its own just processing from that. But the processing is kind of arbitrary. right, and flawed without your input. And there's still going to be arbitrary and flawed ideas in your mind when you start giving it what it needs from you, which is to stop rubber stamping its conclusions. And then it will seek and achieve better, ideas, or filter out bad ones gradually. But as you do that, then those good ideas will actually have a ripple effect on the environment, like the mental environment, even the physical environment, in the sense that we do stuff with our bodies based on our ideas, right? But ideas will spread to other people that are more helpful for them as well. And the more everyone does it, then the more just by default, right, when the mind's just bopping along doing what it does, then it'll be working on better ideas or kind of operating on better ideas. So we're better off as other people do this as well. And then again, we don't stop with just quarantining conclusions. We're trying to solve the murder, so to speak. We want to get to actual correct ideas, particularly ones that are going to be impactful, especially, and those are going to be first and foremost like meta ideas about who we are, how our mind works, goals, faith, love, goodness, understanding, God, right? The nature of the physical world in a sense, in terms of basically how it interacts with consciousness and our minds and things like that. Okay. I'm going to take a moment break, and then I will continue on to the next slide that has some examples. Turn the webcam off for just a moment. I'm back here. Just show. Okay, great. Okay. By the way, I'm going to, not necessarily on this webinar, but you don't need to fret about taking action while you are starting to quarantine your conclusions. You can act normally. I just want you to be aware of your mind's conclusions. And that might immediately start causing you to sometimes reflect or pause in a way that will help you take action that's more to your benefit. But I'm not saying don't act on your best guess of what to do. All I want you to, when I say quarantine conclusions, I want you to be aware of conclusions and realize that even if you're taking action the same, you just don't equate a conclusion with truth. To give a kind of simple, I don't know if it's a humorous example or not, but if you feel like a person is a jerk, you want to be aware that the idea that that person's a jerk is a conclusion. That you don't necessarily know it, but you might still act on the fact that they're a jerk by not working with them or whatever. Does that make sense? So I have a specific method or idea of reasonableness that I'll get to explaining it at some point soon, but not necessarily on this webinar. Again, it's specific and has a specific meaning, and it will be very helpful, and it'll all fit into our organizational scheme and make good sense. So again, this doesn't need to cause you to hesitate or not take action or whatever necessarily. And just as time goes by in the relatively near future, I'll explain more and more, and it'll all, presumably make more sense, and it'll all kind of fit together. Okay. So types of conclusions, judgments about people and or ourselves, right? So if you're like, do something, you're like, freak, I'm so stupid, right? You can be aware that the fact that you're stupid is a conclusion that is not necessarily true or false. Or, that guy's a jerk, or that person is awesome, or whatever. So any kind of judgments about people. You're still going to need to make your best guess about who to work with, how to act, how to respond to people. But for starters, to the extent that you'll only understand this to whatever degree you do until you understand it more and more, then the more you just kind of trust me and try to do this, that's sufficient. Just trying to follow along and quarantine conclusions will greatly get you forward. And then you can have questions and you can ask me, or I'll just end up covering the answers to your questions as I continue, again, during this series. Assertions of truth or falsity. I mean, whether Jesus was the Son of God, whether such and such is whatever, right? Like these can overlap, like these different types of conclusions. Often you might be able to begin to notice that you can rephrase a number of thoughts that you have to put the phrase "it is true that" in front of the phrase, and it would only reinforce the existing meaning of the statement. Someone might say, wait, David, if I put "it is true that" in front of a phrase, won't that be the opposite of quarantining a conclusion? Won't that just rubber stamp or reinforce the conclusion? No, I'm not telling you to like put that phrase in front of a statement in order to double down on the fact that you're rubber stamping it or saying it's true. So if I let's just take the same thing about that guy's a jerk, right? That phrase, that guy's a jerk. By putting the phrase "it is true that guy's a jerk," it is true that in front of that phrase, I'm not doubling down on the belief that that guy's a jerk. I'm identifying that phrase is a conclusion, and therefore I'm doing the opposite of doubling down on it. Again, I'm more like labeling it as a conclusion, but the minute I label something as a conclusion, then it's quarantined, right? Something is known or agreed upon when it's been run through the proper method of determining accurate ideas. And the more we quarantine, the more we want and are open to and can recognize when we see it, the method for getting ideas correct. People don't feel like they need a method to get ideas correct because they're like, well, my mind already gives me only correct ideas. What's the problem, right? My mind's always right. I know when I'm right because someone else disagrees with me, and therefore I'm right. I mean, that's how people act, right? Everyone I run into, for the most part, except for awesome LOI people or whatever, in many cases. But even then, not always. But of course, not that I'm always right, and people should expect that. But when someone disagrees with me, in normal life, then they just immediately assume they're right, typically, and that I'm wrong. Right? That's how people's minds operate. Instead, we can all have some humility about all conclusions, right? So by putting once in a while, I'm not saying that every second in your head you have to say "it is true that," "it is true that," but by noticing that you can put the phrase "it is true that" in front of various thoughts that your mind gives you, then you're identifying it as a type of thought that's a conclusion, and then you can immediately understand that, okay, that doesn't mean that conclusion is not necessarily true, right? What if someone's watching a webinar and is like, well, that's confusing, right? You see, that's the conclusion. Someone could say, but how is it a conclusion, David? I am confused. Well, a few things. First of all, the confusion it's a conclusion in the sense of that the webinar, that the external event is confusing, right? Maybe what's confusing are ideas that exist in one's mind when they're listening, and that it's not that the webinar is confusing, right? It could well be that the webinar is confusing. I don't mean this defensively. I'm just trying to point out conclusions. The point here is not that conclusions that your mind gives you are false, I'm not telling you to start disbelieving conclusions. I'm telling you to quarantine them. Big difference, right? If you find a murder weapon and it's owned by someone and they were trying to hide it or whatever, it's not, obviously like planted or trying to frame them, then it doesn't, you quarantine the conclusion that the owner of the gun is the murderer, but that also doesn't mean the person's not the murderer. I'm not saying that it's false that the person's a murderer. I'm saying you quarantine the conclusion. So ideally, if someone disagreed with me, instead of deciding that they themselves were right, or deciding that I must be right because I'm so awesome, even as high percentage of play that might be, just quarantining both would be great, and then we could just sort of continue from there, and maybe we wouldn't be able to know one way or the other about certain things, right? But we could maybe share some thoughts and maybe there'd be clues that could be shared in either direction, right? If I was having a talk with someone about vaccines, then we wouldn't have to agree to disagree. We wouldn't have to decide who was right, but there might be pieces of the puzzle that come out. There could also be red herrings or pieces that look like pieces, but they're not pieces, etc. So it's different than agreeing to disagree and so forth. All right. Also, if someone were to say, well, this webinar is confusing or boring or whatever, then, or awesome, even, then that contains an implicit statement about the future, right? This next line here. You really want to learn to watch out for extrapolation. Our mind loves to extrapolate. Now, it's really nice that our mind gives us a sense of continuity between the past, present, and future. It would be pretty weird and disjointed, probably. It's hard to even imagine what it would be like to have no sense of what we expect to have happen the next moment, right? Like if I go reach for my tea, then having a sense that the cup has a certain weight to it and that there's liquid in there and what it's going to feel like if I drink it and what the result will be is pretty nice to have. All of this understanding about who we are versus our mind, it doesn't pit us against our mind. We can actually greatly appreciate our mind and what it does and why it does what it does. But we can do it without the adding in the errors or thinking that the things that our mind's doing incorrectly are helpful. And to a large degree, the stuff our mind is doing incorrectly can be corrected. But nothing we can do can make our mind conscious. So our mind's always going to have that limitation. We're conscious, we need to play our part. All right. So why is saying that this webinar is boring or interesting or whatever, why is that an implicit statement about the future, right? Because if the webinar continues on past that moment when you're having that thought, and that thought, if you just examine it, pretty clearly carries the implication that the webinar the next moment will also be interesting and boring, whatever, right? Same thing as if someone says, well, I like apple pie. That's an implicit statement about the future, generally speaking, if you look at what people really mean by that, right? They don't just mean they liked apple pie in the past and they like it just directly in the present, but that they like it the next moment too, you see? So, but any statement about the future is inherently unknown. It can be completely reasonable, and it can certainly turn out to be true that you like apple pie tomorrow, right? I'm not disputing that. It's still a conclusion that isn't necessarily true or false. You see, and it really is of the nature. With the future is of such a nature that you typically can't know what's going to happen for certain. You can make very reasonable guesses that are very reasonable to act upon, but that's different than knowing. And the difference can be useful at times, right? In practice, when it comes to eating pie, no, it probably is not going to matter very much whether, in that case, you distinguish between a reasonable supposition and knowledge, like perfect knowledge. But the general ability to distinguish between perfect knowledge and reasonable actions, reasonable guesses, and so forth, is going to be very important here and there, right? So you very much want the ability to do it because when it matters, it can matter a lot. And as on a practical level, it matters like in a day-to-day simple basis to not extrapolate. Boy, it comes up constantly where influencing other people. The minute we think it's normal or just is the case that a person is going to act or respond in a certain way, or is going to feel a certain way about something, they're going to feel defensive, they're going to feel motivated, they're going to want to do this or that. Let's say you're a guy and you go on a date with a girl, and she's very interested in having an intimate time afterwards, and then you meet her 2 days later. It might be very wise and beneficial to not assume that she's in the exact same mood starting right in the beginning of the date next time. Maybe she will be, maybe she won't, but extrapolating in that way has very practical effect on your ability to act both appropriately and in a way that's going to give you more chance at having that intimacy the second time, right? If you don't assume that they already feel that way right away, they might, and so forth. So that's one example of an extrapolation. Another is just the idea, oh, well, I don't like doing such and such, or that I should learn to use this software within half an hour, or else I'm going to feel frustrated because the last couple times that I did software, that's how long it took. So your mind's extrapolating, using that to come up with a time frame arbitrarily, because this new software might be a different story, right? And that might give you all sorts of detrimental feelings and responses when you're trying to learn that new piece of software. Or you're lying in bed and you're like, oh, I don't want to get out of bed. Well, that's a statement about the future, because the implication of that statement, if you look at it, is it kind of inherently has the meaning that not only do you not want to get up right this second, but you're not going to want to get up in the next few seconds or several minutes or hour either. But your mind can't know that, and your mind also can't know how you're going to feel if you get out of bed and get started doing something else. You might feel great, right? So there's all sorts of instances where it's maladaptive for you. Your mind's giving you some kind of maladaptive thought, implicit conclusion about how you're going to feel in the future, but it's not obvious that it's doing so, because it phrased it in kind of a timeless way, like, this is how I feel about this activity. But there's no such thing as feeling a certain way about an activity. There's such a thing as your memory of how you felt in the past, which could be flawed and inaccurate, right? Our mind constructs memories in a way that's way more inaccurate than we realize. There's plenty of accuracy to our memories, of course, as well, but there's plenty of inaccuracy that can sometimes be shocking. And then there's the present, and then there's the future, which it certainly can't know. And much better when you're dealing with the future, you can develop the kind of mental habit, which is also accurate, about thinking either how you want to feel, or really not thinking about your feelings, because those are just arbitrary and based on the wrong type of thinking. And you're just asking your mind to give you a BS conclusion. The more of a mental habit you have about checking your feelings about doing an activity, instead, what do you check? Bottlenecks, right? And then it kind of flows from there. And if an activity makes sense in terms of bottlenecks, and therefore priority and allocation of resources and focus and so forth, then you don't really have to check how you're going to feel about it, right? And by focusing on the bottleneck part, you'll kind of maximize your kind of positive feelings about that activity or those resources anyway, because it'll kind of be connected right up. And the more, remember this slide with the vectors, the more as background you've taken time here and there in your life to dissolve various goals that you don't even want to have in your mind at all, that are just going to pop up or get triggered, or aversions that you might have based on just random experiences in the past, that your mind extrapolates and analogizes. Oh, well, that's the same as this new activity, so you don't want to do it, right? But that's another type of extrapolation, right? Like, you can start to think, when you have the time and the mental focus for it, well, where's my mind coming up with these thoughts about whether I want to do such and such a task? Well, it must be coming up with analogies of other similar activities that I've done in the past, and then making some sort of judgment about their relative impact and other goals that are in my mind, and all this stuff is being taken into account by your mind that you're not aware of, and therefore you can see the benefit in dissolving and dropping as many goals or old bottlenecks that are no longer bottlenecks, right? Like, a lot of your kind of latent goals waiting to be triggered are based on things that at some point were impactful, but no longer are. Maybe you even dated someone in the past that would kind of get particularly obnoxious if you kept them waiting. And now you're dating someone who's not going to do that. But you can feel like the new person you're dating who's not going to do that will act like the old person did, right? Because your mind just goes and searches for analogies and what it views as codes or categorizes as similar stuff in the past, right? So the more of that stuff that's dissolved and the simpler your mind is when it comes to goals and bottlenecks and priorities. And the more you picture things in terms of bottlenecks, the probably easier it is because it kind of fits in the whole mental framework to drop things that previously were bottlenecks and therefore seem like goals are important, but they're no longer relevant to the bottlenecks in hand, or they're no longer part of a bottleneck now or whatever, right? So seeing the world as such and training as you naturally do that more, your mind is going to encode reality that way and just kind of it's going to feel more natural to see the world that way and to think of your goals and your desires and so forth in terms of bottlenecks, and then in terms of obviously dropping things that are no longer bottlenecks. And then you simplify these vectors, and then the ripple effect in your life is great. Huge one here about types of conclusions our mind is giving us all the time: moral norms and standards. What if your mom calls you and says, hey, you should send this person a greeting card for their birthday, right? Or you should even call them on the phone for their birthday. That may or may not be a good idea, but it can be presented by your mom as like a moral norm or standard that you should do. That's why simplifying morality down to caring about people on the one hand and then property rights on the other, individual property rights in terms of how you don't violate people, and then caring and loving other people equally to yourself as kind of the positive sense of morality, then that will help clear out all these little judgments we can make about other people. People can feel like if someone dresses a certain way, and I don't even mean like too sexy, I just mean like not fashionable in some sense, right? People can judge that in some cases, right? Stereotypically, teenagers can do that, sometimes, but people of all ages can do that, where they feel like someone's kind of like status wise, or even like it's kind of tied to a certain morality, status, morality. It's kind of tied to how you should act, and you're kind of lesser if you don't act that way or don't conform to a certain measure up to a certain type of behavior. And there's all kinds of behaviors that are trivial when you step away from them, but feel really impactful to people based on various moral norms and standards. I treat political decisions and outlooks as actually they matter. They're impactful. They might not matter in a practical sense of like that your vote will make a difference. Yeah, I agree. Your vote probably won't make a difference. But first of all, the outcome of the vote can make a huge difference. That's for sure, massive difference. And I reject the idea that I shouldn't talk about politics because that's not the topic. Well, where's that come from? I'm not violating anyone's property rights if I discuss political ideas or I assert that one political idea is better or one particular candidate is clearly better, right? How does that violate anyone's property, or how does that show that I don't care about people? It's actually because I do care about people, right? And I think, without getting into specifics, I think the news is bearing out the statements I made about how I thought that I thought that it was really going to affect people and people would die, and there'd be a lot of suffering, a large differential in suffering and death between who would be elected American president, for example, and who wouldn't. And I think we're seeing that now. Of course, someone could be biased in a way that they don't see it no matter what, but whatever. That's why I'm not going to discuss it right now, but still. So there's all sorts of moral norms and standards, including if someone hasn't decides, oh, why do you have to talk about politics on a Law of Implication webinar, right? Well, that's just their mind giving them a conclusion about what the norms and standards should be, and there's nothing inherently correct about that conclusion. Law of Implication is we're talking about spreading good ideas, and the idea that and ideas that have impact, right? And political ideas also have a very major impact on individual psyches of people, right? Somebody's child. My sister has three children. Two of them temporarily joined the U.S. Armed Forces. Either one of them could have been the one that killed 7 children and 3 aid workers, adult aid workers. All of whom were innocent of being terrorists, and children are always basically innocent, right? Especially if they're young children, right? They're kind of inherently innocent from the idea that they're to be killed for something. But there's an American kid who, controlled the drone, right? Or maybe they were 30, right? Or maybe they were 20, who knows? And so they kill people based on following orders. I don't mean this isn't judgment or not. I'm just saying that I saw that coming. I'm like, if your kids do this, they're going to be killing whoever they're told to kill, basically. And you don't know who's going to be, their commander. And that affects people's psyche. Like the very, not even doing it, but having a child training because these people are like children, they're like 18, right? 19, 20, her kids. Or at least I don't care. You can call them children, you can call them whatever. At any age, right? You're like training to kill whoever you're told, and now we know that they can be told to kill children. Now, was it done on purpose in that sense? No, but the neglect was on purpose, right? Like Rand Paul talked to Tony Blinken in the Senate hearing, and he said, were civilians killed a week or two ago? And Blinken said, I don't know. Is like, well, shouldn't you have known before you killed them? Right. So at best, they didn't know whether they were killing civilians. It turns out they were, and only civilians in that case. So and what I'm saying here is that affects the psyche of the people doing it. So with politics, what concerns me the most is we're making things normal. I've talked about extortion, right? Slavery. We make things normal that in our kids' minds, right? Like my number one priority with my child, my son, is I don't want him growing up within his psyche, it's perfectly okay to extort people. Like to me, that destroys a person's psyche, turns them into a psychopath, right? To think that it's okay to extort somebody, to threaten them with massive harm, financial or physical, unless they give you whatever money you decide that they need to give you to a stranger, like that can't fit in your psyche without destroying it utterly. Once that's okay, anything's can be okay if it's presented in the right frame. Of course, the very same people that think extortion's okay, they have things they think are wrong, right? And they overlap with a lot of things that really are wrong, right? Like plenty of people think rape is wrong, but extortion's okay, right? But then you have this other crazy thing in the news where when Biden was vice president and the FBI was so politicized and focused on whatever, when Larry Nassar, the Olympics gym coach, these girls went and told them that they were being abused, and they were just ignored by the FBI. Their statements were altered, not written down for months, while dozens of more girls were abused. But again, I think these things are very predictable. And I put my money where my mouth is and predict them. I mean, of course, I can't name the person who's going to die because such and such a person's elected, but still. Because what was going on with that drone strike is they needed good news, and they were scared, right? Like there was a bias. Like why was it so neglectful? And those other 13 kids that were just sent to stand there and get blown up. It's the kind of thing that's avoidable. And this idea that there's a norm and a standard that I shouldn't talk about these things. Well, too bad. I don't go by that norm or standard. I think it matters in a whole number of ways. And again, first and foremost, I think it matters that our kids don't have this in their psyche. That, I don't think there's any higher form of child abuse than implicitly or explicitly teaching a child that extorting people is okay. I don't think you can do any worse than that. So no matter what else for my son, there's nothing like when I was being raised, the number one priority was that I go to college and the best possible one, right? That was the highest good. That was our religion, in essence. I was also raised Christian, but really what was presented as the most important thing was going to college. But for me, the most important thing for my son is that he doesn't think that extortion or slavery or whatever is okay. Or that he doesn't think it's okay to sign up to kill children if he's ordered to, or to turn a blind eye. Oh, well, they said it was terrorists, so I'm just going to fire. It's going to blow these people up. I'll believe them. Right? If I'm going to go kill 10 people personally with a drone, if I'm the guy controlling it, then maybe I should find some way to be damn certain myself personally, not just say, oh, the chain of command will handle that. I'll just press the button. I'll blow these people up. That doesn't make sense to me. Why would that be in someone's psyche? If you were going to kill 10 people, wouldn't you personally make sure those people were, each and every one of them? If 9 of them were terrorists, so to speak, that were about to kill someone, and one of them was an innocent child, then you don't do it, right? There's no justification for killing an innocent child. And teaching our kids that that's normal, I just don't get it. I think that matters a ton. I think that when that's in people's psyches, then it's just the ripple effects are astronomical. I think that so much other crime and other things that people do in all sorts of ways, because they think, well, why is that wrong? Everyone else is stealing. They just kind of feel it. So it matters to me a lot. I think we can hardly imagine what a society would be like where children were raised where they were just that obviously respect other people's property. You just don't violate it. You don't burn it, punch it, blow it up, threaten them with a gun, and take all their money that they make so that they have nothing, and that all their work was for nothing, and that they don't know what they're going to do tomorrow. It just seems like yeah, I get that some people might still be mentally sick, but I think so many people that commit crime, it's this ripple effect of the incredible evil that standardizes normal by by kind of government standards and so forth. I think we could hardly even imagine what it'd be like to have kids not raised that way. But I look at my son, who is taught the idea of property rights as the only morality, and caring about people, right? And we stuck with that, and everything can be explained in terms of that we ask him to do, so to speak. Like it just kind of all flows. I mean, there's things like that. Of course, he has to have some skills and know some stuff. He'll be on his own, and we need to help prepare him, right? But anyway, it all kind of that's often kind of negotiated and so forth. We don't violate his property rights, and it's just kind of obvious to him that you don't think that way. So I predict that as he grows up and as a teenager and so forth, he's not going to feel like you can just violate people's property rights in this way or that way, because it's not normal to him. It's not okay, and no version of it is okay. No rewording of it is okay. And because it's a correct idea, it's foundationally correct. So everything in life lines up with it, right? Like everything that he sees and it impacts him or other people, it always matches that, right? The idea that you can extort other people or that some special people can extort other people, that doesn't make any sense. It's contradictory, right? It doesn't fit in with other things. It contradicts how we act in normal life, right? How could you have a kid think that it's abhorrent to go over to their neighbor with a gun and demand $100,000, which most everyone does think that's important, but then it's perfectly okay if you rename the action and rename the people doing it or give them a badge or or whatever. Doesn't make any sense. Okay. Degree of confidence. So this is another huge one. Our mind gives us conclusions constantly about not just there's conclusions, but how certain we are, right? We have a degree of certainty about various feelings or whether we should respond in a certain way to someone or say something or do something or whatever, or whether something's true or whatever, right? So the degree of confidence itself is a conclusion. So instead of I am certain, right, you don't have to rephrase things in your mind or not, but it can help sometimes as you're practicing. So it seems to me that I'm certain, my mind's giving me the conclusion that I'm certain, things like that. I feel certain. As long as, when you say I feel such and such, it's inherently has the meaning of quarantining, right? You feel it, but it doesn't mean you're rubber stamping it. Realness of sensory experience. Now, when I talk about the physical world, how it's ultimately made of reasons and things like that, that can be a little confusing. There was a question about it in the group. It only matters when it matters, and it mostly matters in terms of understanding who you are, getting your sense of understanding like what consciousness is and how it interacts with the world. So that's very important, but you don't need to think about it all that often. You just need to kind of get it right as your background understanding of the world, and then it all fits together. But in order to do that in the first place, in order to understand how consciousness and God, causation, and so forth fit into reality, then we need to be able to think accurately about the realness of our sensory experience. For most and then that will have ripple effects. Understanding consciousness has ripple effects for quarantining conclusions and understanding who you are. That has ripple effects after that. But you don't need to directly think about the realness of your sensory experience. It's a little bit like if you build a foundation and then a first floor, and then you build other stuff on top of the first floor. You don't need to keep building the foundation or do anything with the foundation necessarily if you're building the rest of the stuff on the first floor and you build the next on the second floor, right? So it matters when it matters. The foundation built by this thing I'm talking about here, realness of sensory experience. The things you build on, what you build on from it, right? The second floor would be built on the first floor, so to speak, to the extent that that means that the foundation matters because the first floor is built on that and you're building the second floor on the first floor, then it matters, but you don't have to think about this all that much. So, and I say that because that could be kind of where, in a sense, where the confusion might come in is like, well, why does this matter, right? So it matters in a certain place very much, and then it doesn't matter other times. But where it matters when it matters, which will form a lattice, a foundation for a lot of other things that then do directly matter. So if I were to look down my hallway, there's a little hallway to my right, which is off screen, but it will feel to me like the hallway continues as normal, like where it continues in a solid way, where there's matter and it looks a certain color and so forth. Where if I stand on it, I'll be able to, it'll hold up my weight, right? Because there's a carpet, and on top of that is whatever, like wood and rock and wood and cinder, who knows what's on there. I don't build houses. And yes, it will be the case that if I walk down that hallway, of course, that will all come true, right? Obviously, I don't know the future, right? There could be some bizarre warp in reality where that wouldn't come true, but I certainly, it's overwhelmingly reasonable to suppose that it will play out as my mind lets me imagine it'll play out. However, there is no hallway and color and hardness and so forth where I'm not experiencing it in another sense, and we want to be able to distinguish that. Both of those things being how both of those things can be true at the same time. We can also just picture the same thing in a computer simulation or a computer game. If you're a guy walking around a building, right? Let's say you're playing a spy type game. You're like a spy guy with guns, and you're in a building where there's bad guys, and you have some mission that you have to accomplish, and you have to sneak around and shoot guns and so forth. And they might shoot at you. And let's say on your computer screen, you see your guy over his shoulder, right? Kind of like a third person-ish perspective. And in front of you though, but it's kind of close to first person where you kind of see pretty close to out of that character's eyes. You see a hallway in front of you, you see how it turns off to the left and the right in kind of a T intersection. Then your mind will extrapolate for you in a way that's totally useful, where if your character were to walk forward and then turn to his right and walk around the corner, that the hallway would continue, or maybe it would end and there'd be a door or something, but something would be there, and it would look a lot like something like the hallway that you're on. But if we think about the computer situation, the rest of the hallway doesn't exist anywhere except for potentially in the computer code, and then it's generated if your character walks to where it needs to appear on the screen, right? Furthermore, there might be physics going on actually down the hallway where enemies are walking there and so forth. And that physics might be relevant and being currently processed, even if you can't see them. But the visual aspect of it on the screen doesn't exist anywhere, right? It's might be being accounted for physics-wise in terms of objects being in a certain location that's generated. But it doesn't appear on your screen, and it doesn't appear on anyone's screen anywhere, right? There's no visual experience of the hallway that you don't see, right, in this computer game existing anywhere. And the visual experience is only generated when your character moves, or you move your character to where it needs to appear on the screen. And then there could be parts of the building that are not even generated in terms of like the physics code, and there's no enemies will be generated there when your character gets within maybe 50 steps of it or whatever, right? Whatever the game kind of prescribes in the code, but there's not even anything generated there in the computer code yet. Or Minecraft is like that, where it'll generate a certain amount of blocks around where your character is, and it won't generate the rest of the world unless you start to explore it. Once it generates it once, then it's saved forever in your save file, right? And it's permanently generated. But until you come close enough to a particular place in this kind of infinite world that you can explore in Minecraft, then it's not generated. Okay, so that's just kind of different thought exercises. When it comes to real life, the world doesn't exist in terms of a visual experience, a tactile experience, a hardness, or whatever, in a certain sense. Like your conscious experience of the world that feels like real and external to you. Like when you look around the room that you're in or wherever you're in, you'll have a sense of real objects, right, that have real hardness and color and all that stuff. That is conscious experience. That the experience that you're experiencing only exists in your conscious field. Some underlying precursor to that experience, some underlying reality exists independent of your conscious experience, or you wouldn't experience what you're, you wouldn't be able to, just like the computer code has to exist regardless of what's on your computer screen or where your guy is, right, in a computer game, or else it wouldn't be generated at all when your guy moves. But you want to be able to conceptually distinguish between the content of your conscious experience of the external world and physical reality and whatever underlies that conscious experience, or whatever the code is. The code exists independent of your conscious experience, independent of where you're looking. The physics can still be going on, right? A tree can still fall in the forest and generate what amount to sound waves. But the conscious experience of sound does not exist anywhere without a person to consciously experience it. So you can just think about that yourself. And by musing about it, it'll just be kind of good background and a good thought exercise for yourself. It's kind of a good tangible place to start examining the difference between your consciousness screen, which is everything that you're consciously aware of, both in terms of what feels real and external and sensory, and in terms of your thoughts, internal feelings, right? So anything that feels like a feeling, or it's inside your head, or it's a words or thoughts inside your head, or conclusions, that's all part of your consciousness screen. If we need to refer to it as internal, we can, right? That's a little bit of an approximation or an analogy to call it internal, but it's a perfectly reasonable word to describe it. And then there's external. But everything that you're experiencing, internal and external, you're experiencing as a conscious experience. The content of a conscious experience is something experienced by something that can experience consciousness, what I call a being that is conscious. So you're aware of your consciousness field. The idea that the content of your conscious experience kind of extends past what you're aware of and just kind of sits there waiting for you to see it is not accurate. Your mind kind of gives you a view of the world where it's real and solid and has color, and it basically like as if it was a conscious experience outside of your consciousness, or field or screen or whatever. But just like just like the hallway that you don't see yet doesn't appear on anyone's screen, and therefore doesn't appear as the type of thing that appears on a screen anywhere. It's the same way with the quote unquote real world. First of all, if someone's not looking at it, then there's no visual experience of it. And there's no such thing as the visual experience of a room, for example, because there's basically an infinite or unlimited amount of angles, right? Or potential visual experiences someone could have depending on how their head was tilted or things like that. So conscious experience, the type of thing that can appear in a consciousness field, only exists as a conscious experience and as it's experienced consciously by a conscious being. That then, by starting to think about that, we can start to tease apart the various ways that reality is constructed and what it's made out of. And again, that matters for certain foundations of understanding critical concepts that we then build other critical concepts on top of, and critical concepts like consciousness and who we are and things and God, who has to exist, which again I can get into more in the future. The answers to questions, right, is what I have as foundationalism here, which can form a framework and different places to stand, different clues, different pieces of the puzzle that are certain and clear. Things that are uncertain can then be, we have to act on things that are uncertain. And we're going to do that using reasonableness, which I don't have listed on here. I'll get to that soon. Soon, but not in this webinar. Answers we'll be getting to as well soon, but not in this webinar. But this is a list of a partial list of types of conclusions, and you can add to this list yourself. And I myself have thought of other ones, but it would have messed up the beautiful symmetry of this slide, and so I didn't add anything else on, just to give you an idea. Okay, so that's good for now. That's good for today's webinar, and we will continue in the future. But I'll now take some time and address some comments and so forth. It is true that this webinar is awesome. That's great. Thanks, Megan. Mind blown. Great. Well, too bad. Oh, you like that about the politics? Well, too bad if someone doesn't want me to. Yeah. You know, I'll have plenty of humility about things I don't know, right? And I can assert something or give a judgment. But again, you know, something can be reasonable too. And if I look at something. Thank you, David. This is awesome. Wonderful, Kim. I'm so glad. Incredible, Mike says. Top 3 safest, least violent country in the world based on international ongoing respecting property rights and life. Iceland, New Zealand, and Portugal. Haha, Megan's in Portugal, so she's touting her decision, which may well have been a very good one. Beautifully organized and presented webinar, lots of clarity. Yep, and it's pure luck, right? It's well organized. Don't get used to it. When I say luck, of course, what I mean is that I just, I couldn't tell how many hours, weeks, days, months it would take till this particular organizational scheme came together for Law of Implication. But now that we have it, we'll have it forever. I don't think we'll really need another different one in the sense of an overall flow of explaining I don't know, a certain organizational principle and flow. And I'm very happy with it. I think it'll be great for new people and great for old people to finally kind of get a sense of they can grasp the whole thing as kind of a whole and then see where everything else fits into it. And I even had another slide that I didn't get to, but listing some of the old concepts of LOI, and I was going to maybe just point out how things kind of fit in, but I kind of got long on time. You're very welcome, Mattias. Okay, looks like we can just praise me here, and then I can end the webinar, and then we can get into some discussion more in the future. Yes is probably a type of bottleneck. Actually, I see why. The explanation of quarantining. Oh, let's see what she wrote. Obviously, great. My audio worked. Okay, good. The explanation of quarantining conclusions is so clear. Oh, good. I'm glad. I can see how it applies immediately to a current open question. Oh, wonderful. Yeah, it's super counterintuitive to quarantine conclusions. be careful about being arrogant about it. Be careful about having an arbitrary timeline of a standard and a norm about how cool you are and how awesome and smart you are and competent you are and how perfectly you do it right away, right? Instead, just kind of be humble. And I'm talking to myself here too, about doing it. It's not about getting an award for how quickly and perfectly you do it, right? But just about looking for that. But you might just spot it in an appallingly large constant stream from your mind, as you start to look for how much people, how many things, right? Conclusions. The very fact that a webinar is awesome or boring or whatever, or confusing, the fact that in and of itself is a conclusion, right? And an extrapolation about the future and so forth can be eye-opening. Elio says, I feel like I need a memory palace of quarantine conclusions. Yeah, there's something though where I feel like it can be pretty easy to start to recognize these things. There's a way that it kind of just creates a virtuous cycle with your mind, I think, where your mind just kind of gets more used to having you notice these things. If you think about it, we're designed in a way where we need to use our power. We have an ability to use our power, but it's not done for us. But it's not the case that our mind is always going to work against it. It's like it works against it, has a defense by default. But as you get started, it's like everything kind of the same mechanism. It's like this in anything you do in life, right? The same inertia that makes it difficult to get started is the same type of physics, engine, so to speak, that gives you momentum as you get started. So the same thing that's kind of working against you as you get started, and that makes it so hard for people to figure this out in the first place. That inertia, as you start to quarantine conclusions, you'll get better at it, and your mind will give you your mind will actually work in your favor and give you momentum toward doing it. It'll get easier and easier. So things are really rigged for us to win eventually. And now that you've heard this, things are really rigged for you to win overall, and for us to collectively win overall in existence. I'm so optimistic and certain about overall things turning out okay and us getting this figured out, not just us here on this webinar, but overall as people, us getting these ideas to everybody. It's another reason why I don't have a problem talking about politics or whatever. You'd think, well, one could look at it the other way and say, well, David, if you're going to win the war, why do you worry about the battles? But the battles is all we have, right? Like the moment by moment stuff matters, and it snowballs. And it's just obvious that, to me, political ideas make such a difference in individual people's psyche, and then in the collectively in people's lives. And they're just a great example. To me, there's just such a good example of I don't know, like they're like a megaphone or a magnifying glass. Everything's exaggerated in terms of impact. It's in essence the argument for and against talking about politics is the same argument for and against going to extremes with any mental exercise, or when we're looking at ideas. And me, I'm very in favor of going to extremes mentally in terms of our thinking and our mental exercises that can actually prevent us from having to be violent and going to extremes like in real life. Like in real life, there's all kinds of extreme violence going on all over the place. Not in my neighborhood, right? I have privilege and so forth, and I live in a beautiful place. But there's a lot of it, there's plenty of it going on. The more people are willing to think about this stuff and confront it, the more we're willing to call someone a psychopath for agreeing to kill whoever a politician tells them to, maybe the less people actually get killed, right? What's worse, to call someone a psychopath or to shoot Ashley Bobbitt, right? It just horrifies me to this day, just having her just get killed in cold blood, and it was okay, it was normal. Or these 10 people in Afghanistan, or the 13 kids that were basically just sat around. It reminds me of Abraham Lincoln, who enslaved all those children in New York and sat those boys down to stand in front of cannons, basically, and get their bodies blown apart by cannons in the South. Just horrifying to me. And I mean, basically, those 13 kids and the hundreds of other Afghan civilians that were killed were used as basically cannon fodder, standing around waiting to get blown up, and then they did. You know, rather talk about those things and confront extremes in our mind than have them happen in real life. And I think it's kind of one or the other. You know, so. But I say politics is like a magnifying glass or a megaphone on ideas, because it shows you have people really dying or really getting extorted for hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars. Like those things show where bad ideas lead, and they're real, like they're actually happening, you know. So it's not like a theory about this might happen or that might happen, but it's going on right now. And so it kind of lets us see symptoms writ large. And I think seeing these things and seeing what they can lead to, anything that can jolt people awake or help people to see or understand, is worth the supposed unpleasantness of confronting those ideas in the first place. I don't really get what's unpleasant, but you know, like or if I use rape as an example, you know, like if that's unpleasant to refer to it, well, it's much more unpleasant to have it actually happening, you know. So to confront these ideas in our mind and to be willing to see them magnified, you know, to combat them. Right? I'm actually, of course, trying to get us to a peaceful place, but by looking at where violence is constantly implicit or explicit. But I'm not looking to have violence, I'm looking at peace, right? Madia says, do you believe in education for kids, meaning sending them to school? I'm interested in knowing what things do you expose your son to and what things you don't want to expose your son to. What I most want to avoid, and what I have avoided, is where particularly extreme evils, and I view taxation as an extreme evil. It's normal, so in that sense, it's not extreme. But it's extreme if you just step back and if you don't obfuscate your vision with the normalcy of it. If a psychopath by definition has to be an outlier outside the norm, then of course someone's not a psychopath for believing in taxation. But if you step outside of it and say a psychopath is someone that thinks it's perfectly fine to walk up to their neighbor, point a gun in their face, and demand $1 million, or else they're going to, you know, do some major things to their body and their finances, then by that definition, then anyone who supports taxation is a psychopath, right? So it's radically different depending on whether you buy into the all importance of norms and standards, you know, or not. But yeah, like I didn't send my son to school because at an early age, I didn't want it to feel normal to him. In school, they make all sorts of things feel normal. Suppose they just simply have a picture of Abraham Lincoln and treat him like he's a normal person. Well, Abraham Lincoln enslaved tens of thousands of boys in the North. Yes, he issued a proclamation to free other people's slaves. Big deal. I'm super glad that happened. That's worth an enormous cost that someone personally can pay, not someone else's life, but their own, or their own resources, right? I would pay, or I would honor other people paying massively of their own property to free slaves, right? That's an incredibly wonderful, impactful thing, and I obviously massively support slaves being free. But Abraham Lincoln being venerated when he enslaved tens of thousands of boys in the North, and did about the worst thing you can do to a slave, right? Which is to both encourage them or force them to kill, pretty much, and force them to stand in front of cannons and guns and muskets and get body parts blown apart, and just, you know, like it would, if you did that kind of thing to like a terrorist, so to speak. Of course, the word terrorist has no meaning anymore, right? White people are terrorists, you know, according to the Biden administration at this point. And the government now uses it to mean anyone that fights against government, which is not the meaning of a terrorist. That's like a rebel, or the founding fathers did that, but whatever. So let's say you take 10 real, you know, original meaning terrorists, right? Where they just like to blow people up that are, you know, for no reason. Sorry, I weirdly lost my train of thought there with the slave. If they were tortured by doing the exact same thing to them that Lincoln did to these boys in the North that he enslaved, then it would, you know, be all sorts of horrific human rights violations, right? If they were made to walk 500 miles with no footgear, right? And then they were made to stand in front of cannons that were fired randomly and killed some of them. Some people where their bodies were blown into mist, and then others were shot with muskets. Others of them lived. Others were forced to kill other, basically innocent people defending their homes or whatever, right? Then that would be a horrible human rights. Anyway, so it's dead obvious that doing that was so monstrous that it should blow our minds. Sending them to a place where they would venerate Lincoln or FDR or Truman, right? Who, of course, on purpose burned a whole bunch of children to death because they were Japanese children, and that made it okay, right? Something about the American psyche, Asians are real easy to dehumanize, right? It's very easy to be racist just in American culture, to this day, right? They're horribly oppressed when it comes to college. Asians are, right? And it's normalized where the courts uphold it, and so forth. So something about Asians, doesn't really count to this day, right? When it comes to burning them alive. And so yeah, things like that. And then, of course, the normalization of taxation. But any one of them is enough, right? Just normalizing slavery, such as what Lincoln did. Slavery is currently illegal in America as long as the federal government does it, as I've said different times. There was a specific case about it in the early 1900s regarding jury duty, but it's also legal. The draft is currently illegal, but it can be made legal anytime through a pretty simple vote, right? It's not deemed unconstitutional, so it's just a matter of legislation passing it, which is, direct slavery. And then there's other ideas that aren't really governmental or so and such, but just this idea that there's a scarce number of jobs, that pretty much the only way to have money, status, and women in life is to get a job in the first place rather than be an entrepreneur. But then especially that there's a limited number of them and we need to outcompete and elbow, out or the people next to you in order to get those jobs. And if you, do a good job as an adolescent in school, then everything's paved for you, everything's easy, you deserve a whole bunch of income and status for the rest of your life, no matter what you do after that, right? Like your whole future and status is determined when you're 16 and 17 and 18 and 19. It's all just pretty sick and counterproductive and bizarre. So things like that is why I didn't want him in school. If he chose to go to school or chose to go to college, once he has the right foundation and background, and there's a good reason for it because he wants to enter a profession, we need to comply with government because they're crazy, right? They're violent and nuts, and they will do all sorts of horrific things to people at the drop of a hat, including just put you in jail, right? Putting you in jail will destroy so much of your life, right? If you even think it through, what would happen if you went to jail now? You lose all your clients if you had them. You could lose your place of residence, and just horrific. So because these crazy violent people would do all sorts of things, you should probably comply, right, with government stuff. And so if you want to be a lawyer or a doctor or any one of a bazillion professions, you have to get some kind of government approval first, right? And then you probably might have to go to college in order to do that. And so, if he wants to choose, that's fine. But I wanted to have him have the basis first. Also with boys, right? Some of what I'm saying is slightly verging on opinion and so forth. But generally speaking, you're graded, especially early, on whether you're a good girl or not. In essence, like kind of you go along to get along, and you do things that are going to be kind of adaptive for women, or for the not what should be a woman's role, but what kind of realistically speaking is more something that a woman is going to end up with, like interacting with babies, right, and infants and young children. I think just this is a scientific judgment call, and I'm not going to die on the hill of it if someone wants to disagree. Individuals can vary widely, but in a gross general way, women have a certain propensity towards personality types and activities and ways of thinking that are going to be more appropriate for dealing with young kids, right? And men are more for like group activities, going out of the environment and doing a task. It's more like a career-based, whatever. I'm not saying it should be that way. I'm not saying that people should conform to those roles at all. But in school, there's just certain ways that the girls have an easier time acting. That is just they tend to be easier, right, to deal with in a educational group setting. And so that kind of sets the standard. And then I think just in terms of numbers, you're going to more often have women teachers. And so it's just going to naturally feel to them like the types of behaviors that girls do and that girls are better at is how everyone should act. And boys will be judged by those standards, and they'll be more often told that they're bad and that there's something kind of wrong with them and diagnosed with ADD or things like that. And so, and then, you try to do whatever, or just being diagnosed as being, relatively bad, right? And I don't mean like bad, like horrifically bad, like they belong in juvenile facilities, but just like this kind of constant drumbeat of you're good at this, but you're just kind of bad here and bad there and bad here. That's how I was made to feel growing up. Even though I was pretty good at school, I was still made to feel like I was bad, for not just doing just what the teacher, wanted, or being a good girl or whatever. And so, there's just kind of this cascade of things. And then they just take, kind of forever to teach people stuff as well. And so, in an hour a day, my son can pretty much learn all he needs to know to be, on par or past where school is or more. And he finally joined a co-op, which is beautiful. I don't mean finally, like it should have happened earlier, but he's at a great age at 9 where he's once a week, they're doing a co-op, which is like a nice Christian co-op thing that's international, called Classical Conversations. And I'm pleased with that. And it kind of helps deal with some potential kind of bottlenecks in terms of interacting with others, doing kind of public presentations and just sitting there. I still want him to be able to have a sense of sitting somewhere for a day if he needs to. That might come up where having no exposure to that, could be just in our world detrimental to adapting to certain situations. So good that he's doing that and he's not particularly fighting it, which is nice. But I think this is a good age for him. I think trying to do that 2 years ago would have been really tough. And it's a tough, there's not a lot of existing ideas and structure, even ideologically or in terms of advice and stuff, for raising a child where you're not violating their property rights. We still kind of set certain rules in order to do various things. But when you're part of a household and he wants stuff, he wants activities that he does with his mom and me at night, or even doing their teeth together and stuff like that. Like if he wants that, or just putting him to bed in a nice way, then there's a give and a take where you have to do this, as part of the family, but it's part of, again, kind of negotiating the give and take. It's not really like we're going to whack you if you don't do it, or we're going to take something away that's yours if you don't do it. It's not like that. So raising a child without violating their property rights is completely doable with plenty of boundaries and so forth. There's no, as I'm seeing now, there's not really drawbacks. And again, I want to see, I'd like, to raise a child where they don't have that sense that their property rights can just be violated because I'm your daddy, right, or your mommy, or authority figure or whatever. Because how is that a reason? If I have to keep them safe, like there's things, but that's not violating someone's property rights anymore than if anything analogous to what I do to a stranger, right? I would tackle a stranger out of the way of a car, right? So there's just a fair amount of that type of stuff that goes on when you have a child, is where you have to push their body and manipulate their body. And when, obviously when they're 6 months old, then you have to change their diaper, right? And, you move them and so forth. So I don't mean, we're not like extremists with it, or not even extremists, but dumb with it. Anything that makes sense, either I'm wrong about or you should do, right? So, but just in terms of, it just kind of all works. But we have to kind of invent things, and you don't have a lot of standards and norms, because the standard and norm for raising kids is they think all sorts of horrors are normal. And even just that someone could look at Abraham Lincoln and be like, yeah, he's awesome. I get that someone might not know the fact that he enslaved so many kids from the North, but you can connect the dots at some point. Like the army came from somewhere. He just literally invaded another region, another place, which, just horrific. You're very welcome, Matthias. And any time that your own thinking accurately leads you clearly to a conclusion, go with that. If it seems to contradict something that I'm saying, right? Of course, you might also want to ask me about it, because maybe I have reasoning that I can explain. But if I'm wrong about something, then I'm wrong about something. Especially with kids, I want to be careful and humble, have humility about, what I'm saying. Elias says, it's very weird. I've had to move house every 2 weeks in the last 2 months. It's like I don't have time for this seminar. It's going to confuse me more. I was like before. But yet again, your approach is brilliant. I also believe in the inevitability of success with LOI. or an equivalent in change in the world. It will happen. Thanks, David. You're very welcome, Elias. Yeah, I get the feeling of like, okay, I could skip this one, and of course you might be fine if you guys do, and then there's always a recording. But it's nice to come on live, get that experience well when it applies, and certainly if you're to get to it at some point. Lauren says this extra idea of quarantining conclusions is really helpful, even more clear than not rubber stamping. Yeah, I'm super excited about this. I think it might be deceptively simple, but to me it changes the game greatly to have this just this overall organization of law of implication, how everything's going to fit into this. So excellent. All right, guys, I will sign off here, so to speak. Appreciate so much your participation and not just today, but then overall, long term. Yeah, interesting about the boys. Again, that there might be some of my opinion slightly there, or like my judgment, but you can tease that apart and come to your own conclusions. I don't really ever want to lecture or scold people, or do whatever. It's kind of tough, right? Because sometimes I'm talking about ideas where, but anyway, try to walk the line. I don't necessarily think I'm perfectly successful with it, but whatever. Okay, take care all. You're very welcome. Thanks, Faith. I appreciate that. That's a great discussion. You're welcome, Ashley and Karen. Okay, guys, have a great couple of weeks. I will probably do one of these in 2 weeks. I'll try to let you know. When I go to the last minute, like I did with this one, I was not sure, and so I was trying to hold off instead of saying I wouldn't, and then it turned out it all came together, and I did. I do want to get the definitive series made, but we'll see. And this might be a very appropriate one just to put as the second one in the definitive series. So I think I'll do that, and then I can always replace it or something if I want to. Take care. Bye-bye.